So the ninth commandment, Exodus chapter 20, verse 16. Do not give false testimony against your neighbor. Do not give false testimony against your neighbor. Just as a reminder, the commandments that were given to God's people were given with the intent of helping them understand what it meant to live in society with one another. That is, you can imagine, you can have people of all kinds living in communities, and just like we experience even at the most intimate of our levels of relationships within our own family, we know that there's oftentimes stressors on those relationships in our homes. And sometimes there's conflict because we all know that we are people who are broken and faulty. Certainly, that challenge goes beyond the borders of our homes and into society. And it was inevitable that there'd be disputes, that there'd be conflicts, and that there would even, in more extreme cases, from time to time be crimes, right? Crimes perpetrated from one person on another. And so it was going to be necessary from time to time for there to be such things as mediation, adjudication, when you had two parties coming together that had some kind of conflict that they were unable to resolve themselves, mediation would be necessary. We know that even today we need such things as mediation in order to restore justice and fairness to the parties that happen to be involved in the particular conflict. But here's the trouble. If in the course of trying to determine and to pass judgment and to ultimately bring back equity, at least as best as we can, to that particular situation, it becomes really difficult, in fact, probably impossible, if the people who are involved in explaining the details of what is happening, if they're giving false information. Right? You can imagine, some poor judge who's listening to the arguments that are being made from both sides, hearing the sides of the story as they're coming, and those two different sides have two wildly different perspectives. I mean, that's challenging enough. Now, just imagine if you were to add into that soup, of conversation, people who are deliberately changing the facts, if people were deliberately giving false testimony. And so, God, in an effort to ensure that there was such things as the possibility of bringing equity and fairness into our relationships, he demands from us in this ninth commandment to not give false testimony against our neighbor. Because false information is the enemy of justice and fairness, right? Really at the heart of it, that's one of the big problems. When we falsify information, when we don't give all of the facts, when we don't talk in such a way that we are truly sharing the truth, whether it is something that we're doing to purposely falsify information or withhold information that would be necessary in order for a person to understand the full context of a particular thing, we are actually putting ourselves in the position of being the enemy of justice and fairness. And so to protect people, God prohibited witnesses when they were brought into the conversation from giving false information. Now, there is, of course, a broader scope in which we understand this commandment, the general prohibition on really all forms of lying, right, of deceitfulness. I want to share with you just 4 ways in which we sometimes lie about certain things. Number 1 would be what we might call invention, right? Invention is the kind of lying that comes about when somebody just simply makes something up, right? Produces what appears to be factual information, but really has no basis in reality. It's purely made up. Another way in which we lie is sometimes by falsifying. That is, there are certain facts that kind of go along with, whatever the particular point of the conversation is, but we change the facts. If you think that is something we are not prone to do, I would just encourage you to think about how we might sometimes be guilty of changing the facts when it comes to certain information. One way we do it very commonly is through exaggeration. We think that to exaggerate something is really not so big a deal, right? To exaggerate the facts, but the truth is, exaggeration can often bring an entire change to the facts of the matter. A third method of lying would be evasiveness. Now we're going to get into something that's probably a little more common in our everyday experience. Evasiveness is using ambiguity, right? It's when a question is asked, it's not really answering the question. It's looking for ways to provide an answer, but it doesn't actually provide the answer that you know the person who is asking the question is looking for. How many of you heard of half-truths, right? A half-truth would be a sort of evasive tactic when asked about some particular thing. Ambiguous language that it allows us to feel like, well, I didn't really lie. I just, I maybe didn't share all that was asked. I mean, the specific question was asked. I gave a specific answer that was true. Yet the reality behind it is that it was evasive. And then the fourth thing is technicality. Anybody ever said something that was technically true? Right? Just, you get called on it later. Well, technically what I said was true, right? Technicality. That is, we say something in such a way that all the information that we provide is in fact factual, but it's presented in a way that is intended to deceive. It's intended to allow the person who's listening to our words come to a different conclusion than they would if we were, not just trying to survive on mere technicality. Now, if you were to ask God, hey, God, share with me some of the things that really, really bother you, really upset you. We kind of looked at some of these last week. Proverbs 6, verses 16 through 19, says something very interesting about the nature of this God that we worship. The God that we were just a few moments ago standing up singing these great songs to. Proverbs 6:16, the Lord hates 6 things. In fact, 7 are detestable to him, right? And so the poet here in these wise sayings is going to hand us a list of 7 things that God hates, that he detests. Arrogant eyes, a lying tongue. Yeah, that made the list. A lying tongue, one of the things that God hates. Hands that shed innocent blood, right? So in between arrogance, right, we know that God is vehemently opposed to the proud, to the arrogant. Obviously, God is, we discovered a few weeks ago, against those who shed innocent blood, right, the murderer. And sandwiched in between those two things is listed a lying tongue. A heart that plots wicked schemes, right? There's an element of deception there that's being talked about, right? A heart that plots, a heart that sets out to scheme against another person. Feet eager to run to evil. A lying witness who gives false testimony, which of course is relevant to exactly the command as it's given in Exodus chapter 20. And one who stirs up trouble among brothers. So among these 7 things that God hates, which if we were to just take a census on guessing, what are the kinds of things that God hates? I wonder how many of those we actually would come up with. But of that list, 3, or perhaps if you use the last one who stirs up trouble among brothers, right, which we're going to find certainly is part of this conversation when it comes to spreading false information about other people, right? 3 or 4 of the 7 have to do with deception, and these are described as things that God hates. Leviticus 19, which provides what is often called, part of the holiness code, right? Has all of these requirements of what it means to be holy. Says this, Leviticus 19, verses 11 and 12. Do not steal. Do not act deceptively or lie to one another. Do not swear falsely by my name, profaning the name of your God. I am the Lord. So among all the other behaviors expected from God's people, it is listed here that we are not to steal from one another, that we are not to treat each other deceptively. We're not to deceive one another or lie to one another. And it's described, any of those things here are described as profaning the name of God. A lot of times I find myself in a place, among people that aren't followers of Jesus, say, playing around a golf with some of my buddies, right? And invariably at some point, somebody might, in the conversation, they might do something like what we would classically call take the Lord's name in vain, right? And they do that, and oftentimes like, oh, sorry, I'm sorry. And it's always awkward for me, it's like, it's not my name you're throwing around. I mean, you got bigger problems than me, right? But there's a sensitivity toward the idea of like profaning God's name in front of a person that professes to worship, to love God. Here we're told that we profane the name of God, right, through our lies, through our deceitfulness. We profane God's name. How many of us want to be guilty of that? Right? We are, through our lying, assaulting the holiness of God. Right? God, who is holy and who wants from his people for us to live holy, right? Lying is an assault on God's holiness. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul says to the church in Ephesus, therefore, putting away lying, speak the truth. Right? So if Paul got up here and was able to speak to a church like ours, one of the things he would certainly admonish us to do is to speak the truth to one another. When you find yourselves in conversation with other people, speak the truth, each one to his neighbor, because, right, and Paul justifies the reason for why truthfulness is necessary in our conversations with each other. He says, because we are members of one another. Right? That is, that there is an integration of our lives that we oftentimes quickly and easily dismiss. Right? Because perhaps we see each other so selectively, once a week maybe, a couple times a week. Maybe we have close friends in the church, maybe we see them a little more often, but all in all, Paul wants us to understand that as a church, as the community of faith, we are members of one another. That is, that our interests are intertwined with one another. So how is it that we could possibly live in harmony? How is it possible that we could have a wholesome community if the very fact that our lives are so intertwined, our interests are so intertwined with one another, and yet we're treating each other deceitfully? And that's why he says, put away lying and speak the truth. Lying is an assault on God's house or on God's household, which we are, right? We are part of God's household. We are part of a community in and among one another. And for us to treat each other deceitfully is an assault on the household of God. Now, I know we never do any of these things, but I'm going to mention them just so you can help somebody else, okay? What are some of the ways in which we perhaps, in 2023, in our modernization and sophistication, in our society that heralds such things as love, and tolerance, and getting along with one another, and being kind, right? Practicing kindness, practicing random acts of kindness, right? I mean, these are virtues. So certainly we would never be guilty of any of the kinds of things that I'm going to mention here, but let me just mention them anyway. We break this commandment, the 9th commandment, when we gossip. What is gossip? Well, gossip sometimes comes in the form of conversations that we have that are based on hearsay, right? Information that we are either sharing or listening to that we do not have any direct experience with, right? It's there may be something that has gone on, or there is some quote-unquote news about somebody else with which we have no direct experience or information. And so it's hearsay. Rumors certainly fall into the category of gossip. The trouble with gossip is it's hearing something that you like about somebody you don't. Right? That's what gossip is. Gossip is hearing something you like, that is something that's like, ooh. Well, isn't that just a juicy tidbit, right? It's hearing something you like about somebody you don't. Right? The last thing we want to hear is something negative something judgmental, something pejorative about a person that we love, that we have a great affection for, right? If there's a person with whom, this person is a person I really, really care about, I'm not going to put up with gossip. I'm not going to put up with things that are being said about that person, right? Because of my love, my affection for them. I'm also not going to put up with gossip if it's relatively harmless. If it is in fact harmless, there's a good chance it's probably not even going to be shared, right? Gossip is something you like about someone you don't. And why is it that we would rather hear something that's bad about our neighbors? Why is it that we'd rather hear something bad about another person than something good? Somebody starts saying something good about another person, right? We're listening with kind of half an ear, waiting to move on to the next thing. But boy, isn't it amazing how we really give our full and undivided attention when something bad is being shared about another person? Why is that? And why does something bad seem like it's so much more worth repeating than something good? How often do we find ourselves after hearing something good about another person, we're telling everybody we come along, oh, did you hear about that thing Paul did? Oh my God, right? We just, go on and on and on and on. I mean, we might do that, but we are far more prone when Paul did something that was, not so good. That's the kind of thing we have a tendency to spread. Those of you who are following Jesus or have learned that gossip is bad, we all know gossip is bad, right? And we all know that there are certain triggers that help us to identify when gossip is happening. And so sometimes we've worked in some strategies to hide our gossip. You could say to another person, man, I'm really concerned about Jim. What is that? That's an introductory sentence to, listen, I got some juicy gossip to share with you about Jim, right? I'm really concerned about Jim. If you're really spiritual, you might say, I think we should pray for Jim. Oh, why is that, right? And then following that is the gossip. Now, one thing we have to understand about gossip is gossip doesn't have to be untrue to be wrong, right? A lot of times we justify our gossiping because, well, there's nothing that's being said there that isn't in fact untrue, right? All the facts actually check out. All the facts, if a person wanted to, they could discover for themselves, right, that these are actually realities. But gossip doesn't have to be untrue for it to be wrong, right? Gossip assaults another person. One person said it is just as cowardly to judge an absent person, right? This is when gossip occurs. Gossip happens when a person is not there to defend themselves. And this person says it is just as cowardly to judge an absent person as it is wicked to strike a defenseless one. Now, who of us would ever strike a defenseless person? Who would ever physically harm or assault a person who is unable to defend themselves? We see that as a cowardly act. And yet, oftentimes we inflict such assaults on people with our words when they're not present. So we break this commandment through gossip. We also break this commandment sometimes through what we may call slander. Slander is intentional harm, right? It is the verbal assault on another with the intention of harming that person, slandering another person's name, slandering another person's reputation. Oftentimes, slander will treat the facts as sort of secondary, and the ultimate purpose of that slander is to harm the victim. We can slander, again, if we're strategic, if we're careful, we can slander somebody through what we would call insinuation, right? Insinuating something. That is, while we're sharing information with somebody else, we are not ourselves required to lie. We just have to provide enough details to allow the other person to come to their own conclusions on their own, right? And so that if it ever comes back on us, hey, did you ever say such and such. It's like, oh, no, I never said that. I mean, I just said this, right? And everything we said might have been true, because to slander another person doesn't necessarily require us to actually lie. It just, all we got to do is help people to get to the conclusion that we want them to get to. And the problem with this is the way in which it victimizes another person, right? Because the victim doesn't get to provide any defense for themselves. They don't get to talk about the context for the circumstances that might be involved. Listen, the way in which we judge or assess the behavior or the actions of another person, we might be looking at the outward thing, right, the final result of it, but that's all we can see. We can't see what might be the greater context for the circumstances, or what might have been the motivations or that person's intents. Some people do stupid things. Some people do bad things. Some people make poor choices, right? But not because they had set out with a diabolic desire to do that bad thing, right? And so when we slander another person, we leave that person unable to defend themselves. People are presented in the worst possible light, given no benefit of the doubt, and it's very easy for the hearers to just simply judge them privately without any further consideration. One person said, people will question all the good things they hear about you, but they'll believe all the bad without a second thought. So we have to be careful about slander, because the impression that it leaves on the person who is receiving the information, it is sometimes so difficult to actually retract that or to erase the imprint that makes on another person's mind. I'll bet that you and I, we have people in our lives who, for no particular good reason, we have a less than ideal opinion of another person with whom we've had little to no actual contact with, but our assessment of that person has been jaded by the information given to us by someone else. Anybody remember experiencing something like that? You remember ever meeting somebody that you kind of heard about for a while, and then when you come to actually meet that person and interact with that person and get to know that person, you think, wow, this person is nothing like what I thought. What is that? Well, you were in the receiving end of slander. You were hearing things about another that were not completely true. And it's so hard oftentimes to remove the imprint that's made there. So we want to avoid such things as slander. And then the third way in which we break this commandment oftentimes is through flattery. We break this commandment when we flatter. Now, gossip has been said to be what you would say about a person behind their back that you would never say to their face. But flattery is something that you would say about someone to their face that you would never say about them behind their back. Why? Well, because what you're saying is not, in fact, what you really think. It's not honest. It's not true. The problem with flattery is that flattery is unreliable. Proverbs 29 verse 5 says, a man who flatters his neighbor is spreading a net for his steps. It paints the picture that when one person flatters another, what they're doing is they're setting up a snare, they're setting up a trap, right? They're leading a person to their own destruction because of their flattering words. Flattery, although we might think that we can just chalk it up as kindness or some innocent, way to kind of fluff up somebody's own sense of self, it can be very, very dangerous, because flattery most oftentimes is used for things like personal gain or control. Flattery is used as a way to manipulate another person, right? You ever buttered somebody up? What is buttering up somebody? Right? Is buttering up somebody, is that done with the intention that I want this person to feel good about themselves? I want them to have a good day. I want to set them up for success today, for positive vibes. we don't use the word butter up for that kind of thing, do we? No. When we talk about buttering somebody up, what we're saying is, okay, I need to use my words to manipulate, psychologically manipulate this other person so that I can then come around and get something from that person that I want. And so we got to avoid flattery. Proverbs 27 verse 6 says, wounds from a sincere friend are better than many kisses from an enemy. How many of you love being told the truth? That's right, none of us. Right? Last thing we often want to hear is the truth. And yet we're told here, right, God's word tells us that a wound from a sincere friend, right? And we got to be careful about this, right? Sometimes sincere friends can say things in a way that is not very loving, it is not very charitable, it is not very gracious. But when the truth is told in a way that is loving, in a way that is charitable, in a way that is gracious, we're told here that those wounds, those things that cut, those things that hurt, right? Because the truth hurts. But wounds from a sincere friend are better than many kisses from an enemy. The kisses might feel a whole lot better. Right? But like the other proverb shared, oftentimes it's just a net, it's a trap, it's something that's laid in front of us so as to slip us up. So we need to avoid gossip and slander and flattery. Now, how do we do this? Let me just share with you a few principles that'll help us, I think, avoid breaking this commandment. Number one, I need to check my own heart. I need to check my own heart. When it comes to giving false witness or false testimony about my neighbor, when it comes to using words that are intentionally deceitful, perhaps half-truths, or meant to harm, you know what I need to do above anything else? I got to find out what is wrong with me. I need to check my heart, right? Like, what is it in me? Like we said before, why do we like to hear that bad thing about another person, that negative thing about another person? What has gone wrong in my heart where I would be entertained by something like that? Right? That seems problematic. So I need to check my own heart. Well, how do I check my own heart? Well, good news is we all have indicators that help us check our hearts. And that's good because the heart's a tough one. Right? Jeremiah described the heart as deceitful, desperately wicked. Who could know it, right? The heart is this thing that, any of you ever lied to yourself before? Yeah, we do that all the time. We're like, why is that? Well, it's because our hearts are they're in need of not just repair, they're in need of regeneration. They're in need of being transplanted with the heart that God wants to give us, right? Our hearts are messed up, and so it's good that we have certain indicators that'll help us to actually check our hearts. Okay, one of those indicators, believe it or not, is this thing called the tongue. Did you know that the tongue is connected to the heart? Did you know that? I know that anatomically, that isn't correct. You're not going to learn that in an anatomy class. But the tongue is connected to the heart. Listen to what James says about the tongue. The tongue will help us to measure the temperature of our heart. It'll reveal what the heart is currently dealing with. Right? Jesus says, out of the mouth come all of the issues of the heart. James says this, chapter 3. The tongue is a fire, right? So following, like James, he starts talking about, these little things in the world that do great things, right? How you take some beast of a horse, right? And you tame that horse by putting a bit in its mouth, and now you can You can make that horse obey where you want it to go. It talks about the rudder of this massive ship, right? The ship that is out making a voyage on the sea, how it is controlled, how it is navigated by just a little tiny thing like a rudder, right? He talks about how a small fire can set a whole forest ablaze. And he says the tongue is a fire. The tongue, a world of unrighteousness. Everybody say, a world of unrighteousness. Yeah, that's this thing. A world of unrighteousness is placed among our members. Now, if you were to go around and just like, man on the street kind of thing, go around and ask people, what is the most unrighteous part of the human body? What do you suppose the answers would generally revolve around? Don't say it out loud. What is the most unrighteous part of our bodies? Well, James seems to be painting the picture that our biggest problem is our tongue, a world of unrighteousness. It stains the whole body. It sets the course of life on fire, and it's itself set on fire by hell. Wow, that'll preach, right? Every kind of animal, bird, reptile, and fish is tamed and has been tamed by humankind, but no one can tame the tongue. When I read that, I thought about some of the memories we have going to Orlando at SeaWorld, right? And sitting in the stands and watching how men and women have trained killer whales to do stuff. Right? Dolphins to do these incredible things, and all these other animals. James here says every kind of animal has been tamed by humankind, but no one, out of all the opportunities, the billions and billions and billions and billions of chances that we've had, no one has been able to tame the tongue. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison. Oh my goodness. How many of you ever want to say anything ever again? It is a restless evil full of deadly poison. With the tongue we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who are made in God's likeness. You know what that's saying? That's saying that about 20 minutes ago, right, we were all standing here singing these songs of praise to God, blessing God, worshiping God. How are we doing that? Well, 7 of you were doing it with your tongues, right? You were doing it with your voices. That's a joke, by the way. Except it isn't. We bless God, we worship God, right? And then in a few moments, I'm going to pray, and we're going to get ready to get out of here, right? And a couple of you are going to get together, and one of you is going to say, I'm really concerned about Jim. Or one of you is going to say, I think we should pray for Paul. With the tongue we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who are made in God's likeness, right? James he's highlighting the discrepancy here, that we, with the same part of our bodies, we bless God and then we curse those who are created in God's image. Blessing and cursing come out of the same mouth. My brothers and sisters, these things should not be this way. I read that and I thought of, I love some of these companies out there that do septic tank pumping, that for some reason also decided to get into the industry of filling up swimming pools with water. Right? You seen those trucks? Right? I love the advertising, right? We pump tanks and we fill pools, not the same truck. Right? And we're glad for that. Right? That's what James is saying here. Blessing and cursing come out of the same mouth. Like, how is it that from the same spring there's both bitter water and sweet, if you continue reading on what he has to say about the tongue? Right? So the tongue is an indicator of the heart. The tongue, if I were able to read through a transcript of my words over this past week, it would actually give me an indication of what's in my heart. Secondly, I need to test my own words. I need to test my own words. How many of you had a wise grandmother or grandfather growing up? Right? My grandmother, which I recently discovered, I always gave her credit for this, but she wasn't the first to say this. If you don't have something nice to say, don't say anything at all. I don't know that there's anything I heard more from her growing up than that. If you don't have something nice to say, don't say anything at all. I need to test my own words. Like, I need to I need to reflect on the kinds of words that I'm speaking. You know, we're talking about spreading lies, rumors, false information, right? But like I said before, something doesn't necessarily have to be untrue in order for it to fall in the category of what is being prohibited here. Just because something is true doesn't mean that I need to repeat it. Right? Why is it that we feel sometimes so compelled when we hear what is perhaps true information? Why do we feel like, well, everybody's got to know about this? What kind of a world are we going to live in if not everybody knows what's wrong with Paul? I need to ask myself, who am I saying this to? And for what reason? What is the reason? What is the purpose for my sharing this? When I say we ought to pray for, am I being sincere? Right? Am I also ready to call the person and talk directly with the person whom I'm speaking and say, hey, Paul, I'm really, really concerned, and I just want you to know that I'm here for you. If there's something that you need help with, if there's something that's going on, I want you to know I'm praying for you. Like I'm really praying for you. So you call me anytime, right? Wouldn't that be a much more wholesome, a much more healthy, a much more helpful way to deal with a challenge that another person's facing than just simply spreading the information about it to others? What is the reason for why I'm sharing this? I need to test my own words. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, because I know none of you would ever, ever, ever gossip or slander or flatter. I know none of you would ever do that. And so we need to be reminded of this third and final thing. And that is, I need to refuse to listen myself. You've heard the expressions, it takes two to tango, right? It takes two to argue. It's really, really hard to gossip when there isn't somebody on the receiving end of the gossip. And so we need to commit ourselves to being unwilling to listen. Thomas Watson said, "He that raises a slander carries the devil in his tongue, and he that receives it, the devil in his ear." Proverbs 18, verse 8 says, "Rumors are dainty morsels that sink deep into one's heart." I just love the sound of those words. Rumors are, why are rumors so titillating? Well, they're dainty morsels that sink deep into one's heart, right? There is actually a long-lasting effect of having heard the rumor, of having listened to and having received the slander, like the imprint that it leaves on us that I talked about a few moments ago. We find ourselves, when we listen to the gossip, the slander of others, that we are drawn into making judgments about another person that we are in no position to make. And so what we need to do is we need to become the kinds of people that another person would feel uncomfortable gossiping to. If you were to do an honest assessment of your own life and discover, wow, I'm the kind of person people seem to like to share this kind of stuff with, you need to check your heart, right? You need to ask God for help, right? Because those dainty morsels are sinking into your heart, and they are having an effect on you. They are forming you into something you don't want to become. So become the kind of person another person would feel uncomfortable gossiping too, right? And there's ways you can do that. Somebody starts to gossip, make them uncomfortable. Say, We should call this person right now. Let's go get together with them, right? Or, you know what? Let's actually pray for this person right now, right? And then you bow your head and you just start praying up a storm, right? You just start praying that heaven meets earth in regard to this particular situation. I promise you, that person's never going to come and gossip to you ever, 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 ever again, especially if you do it in the grocery store. There's an old rabbinic saying that says, slander kills three: the one who speaks it, the one who listens to it, and the one about whom it is spoken. I need to refuse to listen to myself. Would you stand together with me? I want to pray for us this morning. Band's going to play us out as we head out of here today. Just a reminder that as we wrap up our time together, if there's something you want to pray with someone about, something going on in your life that you want to share with somebody, care ministers will be over at the care ministry banner there. I want to encourage you, don't feel like you have to rush out of here today. I hope I haven't scared anybody from talking and having conversations with other people. Let's just make sure they're healthy conversations, productive conversations. Amen? Right? Because we are members one of another. We are the household of God. We want to protect not only the sanctity of God's name, right? That is, not violate God's holiness. We don't want to violate God's household either. And so let's use our words instead of for destruction. Let's use them for edification. That is, let's use them for building one another up. Not flattering, not falsifying information, speaking the truth, speaking it kindly, speaking it charitably, but building up one another, provoking one another to good works.